guys, Alex Peak Performance Reviews. Welcome to another vlog. I'm here for another episode of PPR Tech Garage, and today's video is going to be about suspension. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail as such, but I'm going to give you the fundamental basics of suspension and all I kind of know. So obviously cars have suspension and they need suspension. Without them, obviously, the ride would be rock hard. A car has four wheels and it has a chassis and platform in which obviously the occupants sit inside the car in some seats. Now, the seats obviously have some pliancy in them, in the cloth and in the material. And actually also, there is some suspension in some way, shape or form in the rubber. And people forget about that. However, if you just had rubber and you had a mechanical fixed mount onto a chassis and onto the car without no suspension, the car would be rock hard. But in olden times, there used to be a horse and cart and a carriage, and they used to have a very basic setup, or they had no setup, so they'd be rock hard. And then the next form of kind of individual suspension setup used to be in the olden days called a leaf spring, and it looks like a bent bowed bit of metal and quite thick wall metal, and it's almost like a banana either this way or that way, and it's made of a load and a number of different bent bits of metal, and these are called leaf. And then leaf spring basically has different sized bits of metal, and it does allow for a little bit of compliancy and suspension. But obviously that was very unsophisticated and very basic, and through development of kind of suspension, different manufacturers made different types of suspension, obviously different operating costs. The first kind of application was a dampener. The dampener obviously allowed some kind of travel and movement, and it basically had a hydraulic reservoir inside the dampener, and it had a piston inside that dampener, and obviously as you pressed up and down on the dampener would flex and move and shock load and move up and down depending on the frequency, and depending on there was like some porous holes on the inside of the piston that allowed oil to go through and then obviously oil to drain back through. But that was, like I say, quite a basic suspension strut. Then there was a strut and a spring. They could both be used together. The spring obviously allowed a bit more refinement, I guess is the word. So a lot more flex, and that's basically what I've got over here. And depending on how sporty a car would be, it would be dictated by how stiff a spring was used. Now, obviously, if you've got a comfortable car, the spring rate is going to be, and even the dampening rate is going to be quite soft, because obviously a car needs to be comfortable. But on a sporty car, the suspension would typically want to be stiff. There's a little more or a lot more science into that, because obviously there's lots of other components that will dictate how a car handles, and that will be things like the anti-roll bar. In America they call it a sway bar, which is quite a good, both terminologies of that piece of equipment is actually really true. Anti-roll, so it's a bar that basically connects one part of the suspension on the left hand side or the right hand side to the left hand side, and the left hand side to the right hand side, and it's just one long bar that goes from one part of the suspension componentry to the other part of suspension, and it basically acts as a brace bar from one point to the other, and it stiffens up the chassis from that point to that point to stop flex and sway from side to side. So it's an anti-roll bar or a sway bar, and is what they call it in America, and I think Japan actually, but we call it an anti-roll bar, but they're both great terminologies that are used. Other than that, you've obviously got wishbones that were added to some cars, and even double wishbones, independent suspension, independent rear suspension, McPherson, so we're going on to different forms of suspension, which was a little bit more advanced than just a strut and a spring. And even there were some suspension systems that just use just a spring, and some even use bump stops to avoid the spring or part of the chassis hitting the spring and getting a shock load through the chassis. So you'd have a bump stop that would stop that happening. And then, yeah, beyond that, I then did mention something that was called a McPherson Strut. And a McPherson Strut essentially is a strut that runs through, and I haven't got one, I'm gutted, I haven't got one at the moment. Obviously we're in lockdown, so I have in a barn somewhere else, I have got a strut, but I'm going to using my arm, I'm going to show it. A strut just basically goes through and works together with the spring. So it's a coil over spring, which is the same as a McPherson Strut. It was first almost patented by someone called McPherson. I'm not going to go into any more of that. But a McPherson Strut is basically a strut and coil over the strut, which is essentially a coilover. And they were the first people to kind of make and manufacture a coilover. So it was called a McPherson Strut. And I think in one of my car videos, my car history video, which I'll ping up there for you if you want to watch that, I remember when the Focus, Mark 1 Focus RS, it was probably not one of the first cars, but probably one of the first mainstream cheapish cars that had double McPherson Strut suspension, or McPherson Strut suspension. And obviously that's quite sophisticated and you know, pretty costly to a manufacturer to put it on. So considering that car was quite cheap, it had that on, and you really could feel it in the handling characteristics. It really was a game-changing thing for the sports car or handling in the car industry. And coilovers were the really sophisticated suspension system that kind of changed the world as such. But obviously you've got different things like your wishbone, drop links, and the ball joints, and all your steering knuckle. They're all kind of attached to different components on the suspensions. They're all parts of the suspension system. On some older cars, and probably I can't think of any modern cars that have old torsion beam suspension as well. They kind of have almost like a wishbone that rocks up and down as the kind of wheels moving up and down, and then the shock loading, like what basically happens on the strut and the piston on the spring, is goes through a torsion beam instead, and the vibrational and the frequencies are transferred through a torsion beam, which is almost like a single strut that runs from front to rear almost. A very unsophisticated bit of suspension, but does work reasonably well, and has been used or was used in cars quite frequently. Other than that, obviously going back to a typical, a very racy, decent coilover suspension, new advancements in suspension has also included active suspension. So things like the magneto ride that you find in Audi, some of the Volkswagen Audi group cars, it's still a coilover, but it also has a rather than kind of just a hydraulic fluid inside the strut, it has magnetically charged particles. So it has iron ferrous, I think, particles inside the coil and inside the hydraulic fluid, and then it's charged. It puts a charge through the suspension, and that then it changes the properties within the oil, and it then dictates or changes the dampening performance. So you can on the fly change different settings, and it's much very, very similar to what you even see in the new Honda Civic Type R, on the Seat Leon Cupra. You have active adjustable suspension. There's lots of other obviously manufacturers that use it as well now, but it's quite an expensive component that can be changed. And what it allows a manufacturer to do is it allows a manufacturer to have a car that can be still very compliant, and you can put it in comfort mode and it can be really quite comfortable, and you can put it in sport and it can be a completely different animal. It can ride like a super exotic, you know, bit of machinery. So there's very sophisticated bits of suspension that has now been developed that is really, really interesting. Actually, if you look at the Koenigsegg as well, they've got this. It's like a horizontal load spring, which is, I suppose, it's much like some of the race suspension you'll see. They call it inverted coilovers. Actually, the 94 Supra had inverted coilovers. So rather than a coilover being put upright, they started to use they used to invert them. So they used to put a bit of an angle on them, and it really used to increase the handling capabilities of the car by inverting them and using lots of different special componentry to allow it to do that. Which leads me to going on to the special triplex system that the Koenigsegg uses. The system that's in a Koenigsegg, and it basically, I was talking about the inverted coilovers, they don't necessarily have a coilover, but they have a suspension that's sat in the back like this. You'll probably see Formula One cars that have suspension that's literally like that, and these Koenigseggs have suspension that does this. It's incredible, as well as also having some normal coilover suspension in the whole car, and it's just so clever. And it's also active and biased in, and it has yaw sensing to adjust the way it kind of loads those that special system that it has like almost like a strut that goes across, and a set of connecting rods that then connect to the two coilover suspensions that are obviously in that operation, almost like that, a bit like some of the Formula One suspension. And it's just incredible. And obviously there's just continual developments in things like that in the chassis, especially from the likes of Koenigsegg, but just so impressive. Essentially, a suspension system needs to take all of the lumps and the bumps of the road, and it needs to adjust the frequency. And obviously it will, again, like these sophisticated suspension systems, will allow a car to do everything very, very well, whereas basic systems will only allow you to fine tune to one specific need. Again, when you're creating a track car, for example, unless you've got serious money, you're going to put a set of coilovers, albeit obviously a very expensive set, and you're going to have a specific dampening setting that's dictated or manufacturer controlled by the company that's valved that dampener. Although obviously a special three-way coilover will allow adjustment in the rebound and the shock loading of that dampener. So it's really clever. You can kind of you can use like a little Allen key that obviously adjusts the speed and frequency of the dampening, and you can fine tune a little bit as to how that car handles and feels. And obviously you can also adjust the height and the ride height using a threaded ring and C-spanners just to do up that suspension to be at a certain ride height. Lots of other things that fundamentally make up the handling of the car and how it rides, how stiff and how flat the car handles and rides, as well as how it kind of modulates the whole chassis over bumps. And yeah, a good suspension system will do that. Aside from things like your anti-roll bars, obviously there are additional things that you could put in the same bracket as suspension, and that would be, you know, brace bars and things like that. Anything that ties in suspension to some extent could be included in that. You could argue that a roll cage and any other form of bracing, be it strut bars and underbars and brace bars, could be put into that suspension category. And any way you can stiffen up a chassis will increase the handling dynamics. At the same time, you need to be very careful to keep an eye and check on bump steer and the centre of gravity for the car and the way its weight is distributed. So it's a very scientific, clever thing, is suspension and chassis setup. So yeah, we all go chasing the perfect car, but the perfect car isn't the same for every person. So suspension is very clever and very key as to what someone specifically wants in a car. But the fundamentals of suspension I've talked about, and again, I'm not going to go into any advanced state of kind of commenting about suspension, because I know very little really. It's something I'm continuing to learn more and more about. I have quite a sophisticated track suspension set up on my Supra. I've changed to a special progressive spring and changed the valve in, the spring rates, and different things like that to cater for what I need from the car. And the beauty of modifying a car, I suppose, allows you to do that. But obviously when you go chasing numbers and track times, it's hard unless you've got an abundance of money to have something that is still quite compliant on the road and still comfortable. For a track animal, realistically, you're not going to have a comfortable car. But, you know, look, we all chasing the dream and trying to do things. And lots of different car companies are doing amazing leaps and bounds into suspension setups, and people like Honda are really, really impressive now with the FK8 and what they're doing with the dampening and the an ECU controlled dampening, and what they're doing to still make a car very comfortable. And that is dictated also by things like anti-roll bar settings, suspension, spring rates, dampening, as well as the control module controlling that. And they're looking at that and the process of that to give you something that can be the best of both worlds. Very, very hard, but yeah, very, very interesting all at the same time. Anyway, that brings me on to the end of the video. And if you've got any comments about anything I've said, please hit us up on the comment section. We always love to hear what you have to say. And I hope you've enjoyed our episode of PPR Tech Garage. And yeah, as always, like, share, comment, subscribe, and we'll see you again in the next one. Bye for now.